Hey guys, Kev here, and I want to do a video talking about different types of locks on knives. And I know some of you probably are well versed in knives and different locking systems and everything, but you know, I wanted to talk about it in case anybody's new to the community, new to the channel. And if you are, welcome to the channel, guys. I really appreciate all the new subscribers. We've definitely been picking up new subscribers. We are hitting up near 4,200 now. I really appreciate that. It's just incredible. I never thought we'd even get past like 500 with the whole lefty thing, so thank you. But anyway, let's talk about different locks for knives. And yeah, I have a example of everything I have. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I have a new locking system on the way. I have a knife coming from Brown Knives, Craig Brown. It's called the FSD, and it has his sort of new lock. I believe he's calling it the Brown Lock, but it could be changed. I'm not sure. It's kind of in limbo because he's trying to make sure he doesn't infringe on anybody. It is sort of similar to the Spyderco compression lock, and that's why he's just trying to make sure, you know, if it is the same, he wants to give them credit. If it's not, so it's kind of like in the details of the design and everything. So he seems like a great guy, and he's just trying to do right by, you know, whoever. So I do have my seltzer here. This is a LaCroix coconut. And yeah, let's get into this. So I'm going to put all these knives up here, and then I'm going to reach up, grab one at a time, and we'll talk about it. One of these, or two of these, are similar and kind of the same, but we'll talk about that. So this one here is the ProTech Knives Malibu, and this has a button lock on it, or what would be considered a plunge lock. And I am not an expert, guys, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm going to tell you what I know, and if I'm wrong about anything, feel free to let me know down in the comments, guys. That's why it's there, and I love that. And basically, there is a plunge thing. I'm really off to a good start here, but basically there's a button here, right? And what happens is when the knife flips open, it locks into part of the tang. So like that part of the blade tang right there, you see that little kind of like swoop kind of notch thing right there? It gets locked into that plunge. I believe that's what the plunge is. So this is the button. You push that, and the button is connected to that sort of rod thing, and then I guess that's the plunger or plunge that goes into the handle when you push it. When you push it, it goes into the handle, and there's a spring underneath that plunge. So basically, if I could cut a hole into this side of the scale, there would be a spring there, then the plunge, then the rod thing, then the button, if that makes sense. And it locks against part of that tang thing we were looking at right there, right? And that's what keeps it in place. And then when you push that aside, you push it in a little bit, the spring depresses, the plunge goes into that hole, and then you're able to swing the knife down. And when it is closed like this, I suppose it's the same situation, and that spring is acting as our detent. It's basically holding pressure against the blade, right? And as I pull back, it breaks free, and then it is able to fire out. I'm not sure exactly how the actuation detent works, how that spring works in there, because I can't really see it, you know what I mean? But basically the spring is what's holding the tension so that you get a detent when this flies out. So it doesn't just flop out like this, right? If it didn't have a detent, if it didn't have something holding it in, it would just flop like this. And when you go to flip it, it would literally just do nothing, right? You need something to resist so that it pops when it breaks. So anyway, that's a button lock or plunge lock. And basically it's cool because, one, it's sort of ambidextrous. Even though it's on the right side here, you push with your thumb. When you're left-handed, you can just use your index finger, and it honestly works maybe easier. Hence why some of the newer ones, like this FSD that I'm getting, have the button on the other side. So even like right-handed, the button would be over here. Because I think it's honestly easier to use your index finger. You get a better grip on the knife. Boom, right? Now that new knife doesn't have the same lock, but it does have a button. So that's why I said that. Anyway, that's the button lock, plunge lock. I love this mechanism because, again, ambidextrous. 2, it's fun. It's fidgety. You can, it's not just a flipper only knife. Like, I don't classify this as a flipper only because technically you can push that button and flip it out. And it's also fun to flip and click, flip and click. It's just a lot different than flipping and then disengaging something here. So to me, it's just an extra sort of step in a good way, if that makes sense. It's an extra fidget factor. It's not the strongest lock, I don't think. I mean, you'd have to shear off that spot right there, I guess, or put enough pressure in a certain way that it depressed in. But obviously it's not locking up against the whole blade tang. It's just locking up against that corner. So I suppose that could be broken easy. Downsides of this are your detent is correspondent with the spring in there, I believe. And if that spring isn't strong enough, you get a weak detent. So on some button locks, I do have another example here. If that spring isn't strong enough, you can have it where it just doesn't feel super snappy like this does. That one's done really well by ProTech. You also have a lot of take up. You see how it's kind of like coming out a little bit before it actually fires out. Even this does that. So that's a downside. And then the biggest downside for me is the button lock stick. You end up getting a lot of stick on some of these. This one's pretty good, and it's broken in pretty well. But the Malibus tend to have really bad button stick. You hear that? I mean, that's a lot of pressure I have to put down to get it to pop. And that is a downside of the button lock. But it is one of my favorite mechanisms, so I really like the plunge lock, a.k.a. button lock. Now, another sort of version of that is an automatic with a plunge lock. So basically, the difference here is that this button is also acting as the deployment. You'll see there's no flip error, there's no thumb stud, there's no hole. I can't just open it. It's locked in there, right? Once I push this button, it will release the blade, and there's a spring in there or coil in there that'll shoot it out, and it'll snap out. This is what we call an automatic, out the side automatic. And now it's locked up. It can't close, right? It has a little bit of movement. That's one of the downsides to this, to the plunge lock. I didn't mention that earlier. It can have some vertical up and down play. Now, it doesn't mean it's like going to close on you. It just means it has a little play sometimes. But then I have to push the button, just like on the other one, to close it. That's the only way to open it, and it's the only way to close it. So it's very similar in the sense that it's using, I believe, the same plunge lock for disengaging. Although I will say I've never had stick on an out the side automatic. It always just... But I think that's probably because I'm holding the button. I wonder if I let go quickly. I can't let go quickly. Because here, I'll show you on the Malibu again. If you're holding the button when it locks up, so I'm going to hold it, let go, now it's locked up, right? There's not going to be any stick now, or very little. See? Because the softer you deploy it, the less that plunge, I guess, smacks into the blade. But if I flick it with a lot of force, you get a lot of stick. And when you're using this type of plunge lock, automatic, you're pushing the button down. So, like, I'm releasing it when it's open. So it would be hard to have any stick because of that, I guess. I don't know. That's a really good conversation. I'd love to know anybody in the comments who knows the differences between a traditional plunge lock like the Malibu and the out the side auto. This is, by the way, the ProTech SBR. This is a left-handed version. I would love to know the answers to that. If it is the same lock in there and it's just a coil spring for the automatic, or if it is a different type of locking system. Because like I said, not an expert. So that's an automatic. I do like that, but I don't have a lot. That's my only out the side, unless you count the Desert Warrior I got for my wife. Now, the next is going to be like a series. So let's start with the Framelock. So this is probably the most common lock type at this point. Well, the liner lock might be the most common, but it's pretty close to the most common. This was invented by Chris Reeve. I believe it's called the Chris Reeve Integral Lock. Most people just call it at this point a frame lock. And basically what it is the one slab that you have. So you have two slabs, or in some cases, I guess you could have one whole billet, an integral knife. But basically what it is a cutout is cut into the frame, creating a lock. So it's called the frame lock. And what happens is they cut that out of the titanium or whatever it is, and then they bend it in a little bit so that it locks up onto the blade. So it has a little spring to it, and that's because there's this relief cut right here, and that adds some sort of tension, sort of spring to the frame lock, so it can go this way easily and then pop back this way. And what happens is, as it closes, the blade is pushing that lock bar, is what it's called, back out, right? It's forcing it back to straight. And then a detent ball sits into a hole on the blade. So there's a detent ball inside here. I'm going way too far into this, but sorry. There is a detent ball. I don't know if you can see. Zoom in. Do you see the detent ball? It's that sort of thing right there that is really impossible to see. It's hidden deep down in there. It's hidden. Man, I cannot get that on camera. Is it just too bright? Is that the problem? There, it's in the back there. Anyway, there's a ceramic, usually it's ceramic, and there's a ball, right? And what happens is, that ball is connected to the frame here. When you push this out of the way, the blade pops over the ball, rides. The ball is riding along the blade right now. And then when it closes, it's pushing that lock bar back out. Boop, and then that ball falls into a hole on the blade. And that's your detent. That's what makes it so that it doesn't just fall out like this, right? It doesn't just fall out. It sucks it in, you'll see. Boom. That's what's sucking it in, that ball dropping into the hole on the blade, so that you have some kind of resistance when you go to flip it, like we talked about with the spring on the button lock. Right. So, again, it's pushing it out this way, and then when it opens, that frame lock, the lock bar, is going to flop. Because of that tension, it's going to push in this way, and it's going to lock up underneath the blade tang. So you'll see this spot on the blade tang right there will end up underneath, and it's going to pop over. Watch. Boop. You see how it slid over a little bit? Show you again. Boop. And that is what your blade is sitting on, and that's creating your lockup. So now it's locked, and it can't accidentally close or whatever until you push this back out of the way. And that's a frame lock. And that's how it works. I know that was the worst explanation ever, but hopefully if anybody's new, it helps a little bit. Now, the downsides to the frame lock are, for me, if you put pressure on this when you're going to flick it, you can't flick it. Because what you're doing is you're pushing that ball we talked about further into that hole, and you're making it nearly impossible for it to fly out, right? If I remove my finger, boom, it'll shoot right out, right? And if you're left-handed and you try to do a reverse flick, which a lot of people like, it's called a Spidey flick. If you put your finger too far up on it, you can't flick it, right? You have to kind of rest down further so you're not putting pressure on it, and then you can flick it. And right-handed, you can put pressure on it with your fingers when you go to thumb flick. It can cause issues. And if you have a front flipper, it's the worst, because right-handed, your fingers naturally want to be all over that lock bar. So the lock bar pressure issues is probably the biggest downside of a frame lock. I don't know, in terms of strength, I don't know what's the best or the worst. All I know is that I've never had any of these I'm talking about like fail on me. I've never really had a big concern, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. Well, one of these could fail on you, and you'll see that in a second, but that's the frame lock, basically, right? It's on the outside, cut out of the frame, aka frame lock. Then you have the bolster lock, and this is a version of the frame lock. So basically, if I took this scale off, right? Actually, I'll do it for you. If I take this scale off right here, this is the Devo Knives Stout, by the way. This is my knife design. The last one was the EDC Nimble, one of my favorite knives. They're both made by the same company, actually, this one and that last one. So if I take that scale off, what do you see? You see a frame lock. It's basically the same thing. It's a lock bar cut out of the frame, a frame lock, right? But what a bolster lock is where something covers, a bolster basically covers the frame lock so that it's hidden. And that's done for a couple reasons. One reason is it's done for aesthetic purposes. It looks cool to have a nice scale on top of the frame lock, right? I think this looks nice. It's a way to add carbon fiber or whatever to the scale. The second reason is it makes it so those pressure issues that we talked about, where you put your finger down, you can't flick it because you're on that lock bar, left-handed anyway, or right-handed with the thumb. Those are no longer an issue because the frame lock is now covered by the scale. So you can go all the way up. Now, yes, you could technically sit all the way up here and have issues, but that's kind of semantics here. But again, thumb, I'm not on the lock bar at all when I'm doing this. If I were to be doing the front flipper, I don't have one on here, but my fingers are low enough, they're not on the lock bar. So that's the benefit of the bolster lock for me. I think the bolster lock is, for me, one of the best. It is probably the best lock type in my opinion, because I love a frame lock. I just love how they operate. I love how they just seem to feel more premium and put together and sturdier and everything. They look nice, I think. So being able to negate the issues with the frame lock by having a bolster lock is kind of the best of both worlds in my opinion. So that's a bolster lock. You can also have a reverse bolster lock, which is kind of getting into weird stuff, but it's basically where the scale is coming from the top instead of coming from the bottom up. It comes from like the top down. So you're covering the lock bar from like here to like here, and then the bottom of the lock bar is still showing. So it still can work in some cases, but that's called a reverse bolster lock. So anyway, that is the bolster lock. And then the liner lock is another similar version. And basically it's just like a frame lock, right? It's just like this, or a bolster lock. It's kind of a combination, honestly. And then what it is it's a scale over top of a lock bar. So it's a liner lock. It's one of the liners in here, right? One of the liners that's keeping everything together has one of those lock bars cut into it, right? And that's what you call a liner lock. There's also something called an inset liner lock. I don't know what else you call subframe lock, sort of. They're all kind of the same thing, but there's ones where a single piece that's just the lock bar is kind of screwed in. And it doesn't actually have liners. It's just a lock bar that's screwed in. But it's the same concept. There's a liner lock underneath the scale. That's why it's called a liner lock. Again, I know I'm an idiot, but same thing where it'll just click over, lock in. It's literally the same concept. It's just under a scale. And the benefits of having that is, again, you're not going to worry about where your fingers are, because pressure issues are not a problem, because you're not putting pressure anywhere on the lock bar because it's covered, right? That's a benefit. I think you can get a little bit of a stronger detent and make adjustments, I think, a little bit better on a liner lock, a little easier, where on a frame lock, you have to basically mess with the whole frame. If something were to go wrong on this, you could just replace the liner. You wouldn't have to replace, you know, the whole frame, where basically on that you would. What else? What's a downside? I think a downside is they're usually relatively thin. You'll see that lock bar is a lot thinner than the one on the frame lock. And that, I guess, could be a structural issue and whatever. But again, for me, never had an issue, and they're strong enough for me. But if you need a super robust knife, then maybe it's not the best thing. They're also usually cheaper because usually the liner is made out of steel. But you can get them made out of titanium, like this on the F5. That is actually a piece of titanium there. And this is kind of that subframe lock situation. That liner is mounted in by these clip screws. And that's what holds that liner in. It's kind of a nested inset lock is what it's called. But it's the same exact concept. So that's the liner lock. So those are your three like traditional locks: frame lock, bolster lock, liner lock, right? Next up, we have the Axis style lock. This one's called the Able lock. You'll hear a lot of different names for it. The XR lock, the whatever. There's a million different names for it. Companies have made up at this point. But it's essentially the Axis lock. It's designed by Benchmade. They came out with it first. The patent ended, and that's why you're seeing it everywhere now. So basically, it's called a crossbar lock, and it takes a bar that goes across crossbar. These names are dead on, by the way. And then you have little tabs on the side that you can pull the bar down, and it slides up and down, and there's springs on either side of these. There's a spring in here called an Omega spring. I believe these use Wolf springs, but it's kind of a coiled spring, right? It's shaped like an Omega, and that's why it's called an Omega spring. And what that does is that's what's keeping your tension here so it doesn't just flop out like we talked about before. But it's very weak, right? You're not going to get a strong spring there. It can easily kind of shake out and bounce. But, you know, it's fine. Give it a good flick, it shoots out, but it is sort of weak, right? That's kind of the thing I don't like about them, is it's a weak detent. It's not an actual detent, but you can reverse flick them. The cool thing about an Axis lock is they're completely ambidextrous. So you have the bars on both sides, right? No problem. The clip can be reversed, and essentially this knife is ambidextrous. You could use it left or right, whichever way you prefer. Now, what happens is that bar sits under the blade there when it's closed, and it's kind of keeping a little bit of pressure on it. And once it kind of gets out of that curve, you'll see how it kind of just goes, and now it's like loosey-goosey. So you're getting that little bit of spring pressure to kind of push it out to here, but then there's nothing. So you have to give it enough force to actually shoot all the way open, if that makes sense. That's the reason I don't like these. I just said that already. So then when it comes around, right, you see that little notch right there? This will lock into that bar. Boop. Locks into that bar, and this, I believe, is one of the strongest locks there is, because you would have to literally shear that piece of steel off. That is the only way to break this lock right now, obviously, other than me pulling the bar out of the way, and then it drops down. So, negatives is the spring thing I was saying. It's very light, so it feels like a light detent. Not my favorite. Okay, but for people who like to slow roll or whatever, it's great. Positive, super ambidextrous, and it's very drop shut. You pull it and the knife just drops, even on washers. That is probably the biggest plus to a Axis lock that people love. It just kind of glides down, right? Another negative is it is very hard to get tight tolerances on them, I'd say. Centering, getting a knife perfectly centered and having no blade play or up and down is very hard with an Axis lock. I've just found more times than not, you're going to get a knife that's not centered or has a little play or whatever. It takes a lot of fine tuning to get it perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It will function fantastically, completely off center. Like, they're very reliable, and they function excellently. They're fun to fidget with, and you can get them at a relatively low price, and you can get them in an American-made knife at a low price. And I think that's what people love, is Hogue uses it and Benchmade uses it, and they sell knives for, you know, anywhere from like 80 to you know, up. But you can get a good knife for, you know, 200 or less with one of these locks with great steel and excellent fidgetability, comfortable in hand, and it's American made. And I think that's what people love about it. And I think that's why the lock is popular. I don't think it's actually because the lock is that great, because I don't really think it is. But it's great because it gets you into a good knife at a great price point that's American made. So what you could basically say is the Axis lock is America's lock. Just saying. We should make shirts about that. Axis lock, America's lock. Anyway, that's the Axis lock, or you'll hear a bunch of names for it, guys. It's a crossbar lock, okay? There's different tabs you'll see on them or whatever, but it's all the same thing, and Benchmade created it. Next up, we have the lock bag. This is the only one I have, which is why I'm using this piece of, I mean, absolutely the best knife in my collection, the Dalica. But it does show us how a lock bag works. So lock back is pretty simple. There's a spring back there, and the knife opens, and you'll see a piece opens up kind of, and it drops in, and that essentially locks it. And then you push this, and it pushes that up off of the spot on the blade that it's locking into, which is down there, I guess. And then it closes. Boop, locks down, open, like this. It's kind of like the evolution of the slip joint, if you know what I mean. They went from it doing this and not locking to having it lock into a notch and locking it. And then you push here, and that's why it's called a lock back, because the lock is on the back. They also have something, I think it's new, it's called the front lock. And it's the same thing, it's just at the top here, so they call it a front lock. They have a mid lock. This is more like a mid lock, and then they have a back lock that's like down here. Like you'll see on Bucks, it's like all the way down here. But it's all the same thing. It's just a tab that kind of notches into something, and this pops it off, basically, if that makes sense. You also have something called the Triad Lock. This is all Andrew Demko's designs, and it's basically the same thing. It's just way stronger and done a little bit better. Hard to explain, but it's basically, they're all back locks. They're just cooler versions of it. But that's how the back lock works. This is not my favorite. If you can tell, I don't have any. I do kind of want to try a nice back lock and see what I think. So I might get like one of those Native 5, like fluted ones or something. But anyway, this is a cool, very old school lock, the back lock. And it's not very fidgety. You know, you kind of have to slow roll the knife, and then you kind of have to disengage and close it with the other hand. It's kind of a two-hand knife, but some people have learned to flick them. Once they break in, apparently, you can flick them. You can also like click and then shake it down, and the knife will shake to here. And then you can kind of close it. And so some people have found ways to fidget with a back lock, but it's not really a fidgety kind of lock, if that makes sense. But I don't own any good ones, and I got to remedy that. I kind of want to design one for Devo knives. We're thinking about doing a back lock. Let me know what you guys think of that idea. The next one is the Shark Lock. And this is kind of a similar thing. This is an Andrew Demko design. And basically you have this tab here, right? So it's kind of a cross between the back lock and the Axis lock, in my opinion. It's kind of a cross between these two. And you just have a bar right here. This is, I guess, what you'd call the lock bar. And there's a spring, right, in there. And you can see there's some spring pressure in there. That spring is keeping it closed right now, much like that Axis lock. Right? If you don't get it past here, what does it do? It slams down. But if you get it here, it's just loose, right? Like we talked about in the other one. And then there's a notch, and this lock bar, right, goes up, and it locks kind of like claws onto it, right? So now that thing is clawed on, and this thing is literally like unbreakable. Again, you'd have to shear a piece of metal off to get it to work. Basically, the knife would fall apart around it before that lock ever failed. So this is one of the strongest locks ever, right? There's different versions of this. This is the Andrew Demko Shark Lock. There's also like the Snex version of it. I think Sandrin uses that version. I believe Wii is coming out with a knife with the Snex lock on it. And it's literally kind of the same thing. It's just the bar is a little bit different. But it operates kind of like the Axis lock, where you can pull this down and it's kind of loose here. Kind of loose here. It's the same thing. It's just on the back, right? But it does make it a little bit stronger because it's going on top of the whole tang, where this is just having that bar. But again, my issue with this is the same as that Axis lock. It's very weak here, so you can easily fail it when you're trying to deploy it. I like a knife that flies out when I break the detent. Now, you can flick this very easily, and it works great. But you got to be careful, because you could accidentally flick it and not flick all the way, and then it slams back down on you. But it's mostly a really safe and awesome lock. I love it. It's very, very addicting to play with, just flicking this thing left and right. And flicking it using the bar is actually like the funnest way to do it for me. So I really, really like this lock. This is the Demko Shark Lock. Now there's companies kind of ripping it off. You'll see Cold Steel has the Atlas lock, and you know, it's just what happens. But it's a fantastic lock, and I can't wait to see him use it in some newer, maybe a little bit better designs, slim down designs or something would be cool, and a stronger spring would be nice. So that's the Shark Lock. And last but not least, we have the slip joint. So this is my Tactile Knife Co. Bear. Absolutely love this. Usually you want to rock a slip joint in a slip, but you can put it in anything you want. Just put it in your pocket. I like this. Keeps it protected, and you get a cool piece of leather on you. I love this one because it's super slim. But what a slip joint is, basically, is has a spring, right? This is a steel spring, and you open it. It has a half stop, so there's kind of like the easiest way to explain it, and I'm not an expert. There's like notches in the blade, and they kind of fall into, so here it falls down, it locks in, right? Here it falls at the half stop, it hits, and it kind of locks into this spot. It's not locked, but it kind of falls in, right? And just by like, you know, pressure or whatever, it stays in this position, and then you have to pull it to get it to hit the last position, which is open. And you'll notice on each one, this spring is completely flush. See how it's flush right here? It's not popped up at all. And then it'll pop up a little bit as I close it. See if I can show you. See how it pops up? Boom. When it hits this spot, perfectly flush again. Pops up, boom, perfectly flush again. That's a sign of a good slip joint, by the way. But it's not actually a locking mechanism. It's just I don't know what you would call it. It's just a way of opening the knife. It's not I guess it's not a locking anything. It's a knife mechanism, opening mechanism. I don't know. But it's super fun for me. I've really learned to enjoy it. The closing and opening is called the walk and the talk. So basically, as it opens, it's making those noises. That's the talk, and the walk is how it kind of operates. That's the walk, and this one has great walk and talk. They've really perfected it as they've made these. This one's actually in Magna Cut, which is really cool. But anyway, that's a slip joint, and the reason it's called a slip joint is because it can slip. And I guess it knocks into joints, I guess you could call it. I don't know. But it's not locked. So, like, you can't just, like, cut through cardboard with this with your finger here, because if you cut out of the cardboard and you're still pushing, you're going to, like, accidentally close this on your finger. And it's going to suck. So this is a knife you use for very light duty. You're always careful. You really just want to hold it like this and always be cutting into things, right? You don't want to put pressure back here at all, unless you know what you're doing and you're cutting through and then you let go or whatever. People use these knives for hundreds of years without, issue. So, like, it's possible to do whatever you need with this, but at this point, you might as well use something that's locking. I like locking knives because it's kind of just a safety thing, and then the lock type, depending on the lock, it's fun, right? For me, it's fun to do this. I like watching a blade fall. I also do like a very nice half stop and a click. So really good walk and talk is nice too, but that's a slip joint. That's probably something you already knew. So anyway, that is all the different lock types that I have currently in my possession. The slip joint, the shark lock, the axis style lock, crossbar lock, the lock back, the frame lock, the liner lock, the bolster lock, and I believe this is it, the button lock, aka plunge lock, and I guess the automatic plunge lock, whatever you want to call that. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. I know that was a little bit of a long one, a little bit of crazy one. I'm sure I bullshitted a little bit, but I'm pretty sure I kept to what I knew, and I said I didn't know. If I didn't know, please school me in the comments. Be gentle. You guys know I don't know everything. I make that clear. But I wanted to give a little bit of an overview to people who are new, so maybe they can get an idea of what they like. You know what I mean? If you're left-handed, here's the thing. If you're getting into knives and you're left-handed, I really think the best knife types to get into are button locks, axis crossbar style locks, this shark lock or a back lock. Those are all very ambidextrous. The slip joint, they're all very ambidextrous. I would warn you if you're new to knives on slip joints, because even though it seems like the simplest, it also is kind of the most dangerous because it can close on you, right? Not knowing how to disengage a lock is probably better than having the lock just not be there, right? And you'll learn how to disengage it comfortably. You'll learn how to just operate a knife. Like, I'm still learning, guys. Like, I started by operating a knife like this when I unlocked it. I would just use my thumb, push it to the side, and let the knife close, right? Or I'd use my thumb, close it like this, right? Right-handed, same thing. You push, get out of the way, close it, right? Oh, that's another thing I want to touch on. A lot of people like this style lock or this style lock or the back lock or this lock because it keeps your fingers out of the path of the blade. I did not mention that. So on a knife like this, a frame lock, liner lock, bolster lock, your finger is in the path of the blade. So I actually have fun doing this, but I let it hit my nail, get out of the way. But what a lot of people would say is that's kind of a bad thing because you could easily accidentally like cut your finger if it's, you know, in the way of the blade or whatever. As you're disengaging, it could hit you or whatever, right? On a button lock, you're just pushing a button. Your fingers are not in the path of the blade, right? On a back lock, you're usually using two hands, so your fingers are not in the path of the blade. I mean, unless you do this like a maniac, but so I guess the back lock's not a great example. It's just a very old-timey lock that's not going to drop on you, so I guess it's seen as being very safe, but let's nix that one. The axis crossbar lock, you're not in the path of the lock. That's something you'll hear a lot when you're new to the community is, oh, I love the axis lock because you're not in the path. The shark lock, same thing. You're not getting anywhere near here as it's closing. And that's what people really like about it. Now, once you get used to knives and everything, to me, it doesn't bother me at all. I like getting hit with a knife in the nail, as you can tell. And then I've learned different ways to disengage locks, honestly. Like recently, I just started doing this one right-handed. I will pull it this way. I'll use my index finger to pull the lock up, push it up a little bit with my thumb, and then let it drop. That's one really nice way of not having it hit your thumb. But you still get to experience the drop shut, right? You still get to experience that guillotine because you're just pushing it and then you're getting out of the way and letting it drop. And then recently I also started doing this one left-handed where I kind of push my index finger across and that disengages it. And then I get out of the way like this. It's not great on that one, but here, like I'll show you on this one. You just push, it disengages, and then you can shake it down. Shout out to Brandon Ziegler. He taught me that, but that's a good way to do it left-handed on a right-handed knife. Of course, this is all different if you have left-handed knives, which is a thing, by the way. Here's a left-handed frame lock, so it's the same concept as this lock, but it's made for my hand, left-handed. And then you do this to disengage it. You push the other way. Let me get this guy back up. See, you push this way to unlock that one. You push that way to unlock this one. And the more you play with knives, the better you get at stuff like that. And it's fun. It really is. So anyway, thank you guys. I love you all. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day. And I will catch you later.